to another sew along. Today we are going to be making the Mary D. It's a sweet sleeveless sundress, or you can also use it as a jumper, and it buttons in the back. But it doesn't just button up the back like you might think. It overlaps and forms a V in the back. It's very cute. But today we're going to be doing something different. Several years ago, my granddaughter came to church in her sweet Mary D that her daddy had dressed her in, but it was backwards. And I didn't say anything, and I really thought it was pretty cute. So we're going to do that, and there are a couple changes we'll need to make because the front, which will now become the back, dips down like the front neckline would. So we need to change that. We're going to change the back just a little bit so that the V doesn't come down too far in the front. And so you're going to need those two pattern pieces. You'll need your skirt pattern piece if you're working with tissue. If you're working with a PDF, you won't have actual skirt pattern pieces, but you will have a chart that tells you what size, what length, and what width you need. Be sure and notice that the view B and C, the width is different than view A. So be sure you're looking at the right view. We're doing view C, and you will be able to determine your width and your length of your skirt panels. And if you have a tissue for your patterns, it will be, for the front, it'll be place on fold. When you look at your chart, when you're not using a tissue, that front skirt piece is the full width of that skirt because you won't be placing anything on the fold. So you will also need a pencil, a ruler, and some tissue paper or whatever you prefer to trace patterns onto. And you can go ahead and trace your front and your back, and then you'll be ready to make the changes. Also, on the blog, on our website, there will be neckline templates where we're going to change the back neckline. So be sure and look for those. You really don't need to cut it out. You can just cut out the square or just print the whole page, and you'll just be laying it under your pattern, under your tissue, long enough to trace it. So it really isn't a pattern piece, it's a template. But get that and gather your things, your fabric, and we'll be right back to get started. Okay, we are going to do a little bit of drafting. So I traced my two pattern pieces in two different colors, mainly so you could hopefully see what it is we're doing. So I just pulled out some colored pencils. So what I want you to do right now, we have the current back laid down, and now I'm placing what right now is the current front. And I'm lining it up so that the corner here matches, the corner here matches, and the corner up in the high point of the shoulder matches. So I need to move that down just a little bit. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to trace the shoulder seam. The slant changes a little bit, and so we want to trace it so that it can now be the back. So I'm just going to go right along there, and I'm using the pink on the blue so that I can see where my new line is a little better. So even though you may have already traced your patterns, you might want to use a different color of pencil or ink pen or something when you make your changes. The other change we will make is we're going to slip this template in here and just line it up again up at the top with the shoulder, and then with the place on fold line, the center, what will be the center back now. And so I'm just going to try to draw a straight line. And then, let me get up. So that will give us a much higher neck in the back. It won't scoop like it did. So now we're going to label this back. I'll use my blue pencil. And now we're going to reverse them. We won't need that anymore. So the same thing, we're lining up this corner and this corner, and then there is a center back line that I went ahead and drew, and then of course underneath there is the center front, which is now the center back. So as you can see, there's just a little bit of difference at the shoulder. Oops. And then a slight difference at the armhole. And then you just ease back into that line. And then the other thing I want to do with this new front piece, so we're going to label this front. But the next thing I want to do is I want to measure 1/4 of an inch up. We're just going to raise this part that will be the V in the front. We're going to raise it just a little bit, just 1/4 of an inch. So what you'll do is you'll go along and just put a dot about every 1/2 inch or so. And once you get closer to the shoulder, we need to ease this back off because we don't want to make the shoulder seam wider in the front. So I'm going to start by just doing it that much. And if you have a French curve, sometimes that makes doing a curve like this easier. You can't necessarily go the whole way, but you can go a few inches. And then move it up, hitting the tripod. All right there. Now we're going to start easing it off. I'm just going to connect that. So this is our new cutting line that will raise that V in the front just a little bit. Okay, I think we've got everything changed the way we need to. So you need to remember now that this line is not the line you want to use now. And then same way with this one, just to remind yourself, you don't want this one anymore. You want the pink. So I always need a reminder. And so the things you need to, when you've got your fabric cut out, be sure and go ahead and transfer the buttonhole markings And go ahead and transfer them to both the left and the right, because it also will be where we will stitch the ribbons or the ties. We're going to use cloth ties. I think this is going to be really cute. And then if you don't want to use ties, of course you can just use buttons, or you can use ribbon. A grosgrain ribbon would be sweet. I've done that before. Let's see. If you're using a lighter weight, lawn weight fabric, I think you're going to want to put some lightweight fusible interfacing on the bodice. So you would do one on the bodice back and then two fronts, and make sure you do a left and a right. And that's easy to mix up, especially if your fabric, if it doesn't have a right or wrong side. So be sure you do a left and a right. And those will become your outer fabrics, and you don't interface the lining. Trying to think if there's anything else I've forgotten. Oh, piping. We are going to do a lot of piping. And so because of that, we're really not going to be following the current directions in Mary D. The way you construct it is different when you want to add piping. And we're going to pipe the armholes, the neck, and across the bottom of the bodice. So I think your pattern requirement for piping may say you need a yard. Well, you're going to need probably 3 times that much. I know when I did the size 3, it took just under 3 yards. And so I would get 3 yards for size 3 and under. You'll have some extra when if you're making a smaller size than a 3, but piping is not expensive. And I did measure the 8, and it measured more like 3.5. So I would get 4 yards for the size 8, just to be sure you have enough. And then I would just get 4 yards probably for a 7 and a 6, and maybe a little less for a 5 and a 4. But the way you can determine how much piping you need would be to measure. I'm going to flip this over. So you would measure each armhole. So that measurement would be 2 times. And then you'll measure the new neckline, and then that would be 2 times. And then you would measure across here, and that would actually be 4 times. 4 times? 3 times. Because you would, let me make sure that's right. Okay, I'm going to tell you different on that. So you're going to measure across here, and you would need 2 times that. And then you'll also measure across here, and it would be 2 times that measurement. I think that's got it. Okay. I think we are ready to get started. Get your fabric cut, and we'll be ready to start sewing. The first thing we're going to do are the shoulder seams. So with right sides together, you're going to stitch 1/4 inch seam allowance, press those seams open. Go ahead and repeat that with the lining as well. Just double check to be sure that you do have your buttonholes marked. And remember, I said even though the buttonholes only go on one side, that gives you your position for either buttons or the ties we're going to do. And so it's just easy to do it now before you start stitching. So get that done, and we will be ready to start piping. And now we are ready to start piping. What I've done is I've gone ahead and trimmed a good amount of my piping down to a 1/4 inch seam allowance, because that's what we will need here on the neckline and on the other armhole. But when we get to the waistline and are piping that, it is a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So you want to leave some of it still at a 1/2 inch. So I haven't cut my length of piping at all. I've just trimmed a good amount of it, and then I may have to stop and trim a little bit more before I finish getting all of this piping on. If you want to use a glue basted to hold your piping in place, you can do that by just putting the smallest little dots of glue within that seam allowance. In fact, fairly close to the edge of the fabric. And we have curves for this, but we don't have any corners. So you can, you don't really have to clip yet. We'll clip after we've got our seams in. So you will do that. Or you can pin, or if you've been stitching piping for a while and are comfortable with just laying it on the edge as you go, do that. But what you're going to do is you're going to do the armhole, and then you are going to put piping along the neck edge. So don't put your piping down here. Just start here and put your piping around the neck and then stop at the other side and then the other armhole. So get that done and we will talk about the next step. Now that you've got your piping sewn on, be sure to go back and pull some of the cord out of each open end, about 1/2 inch. And then as you pull, then it will be much flatter and less bulky on those ends when those seams get sewn together. So after you've done that, this is my last one. Then lay your bodice out, right side up, and put your lining on top, and you're going to match, and have right sides together, and you will match the shoulder seams at both the armhole side and the neck edge side. Do that all along each edge that has piping. After you've done that with the side up, with the wrong side of the bodice up where you can see your piping stitching, go ahead and place that side up. When you're stitching again, leave your same piping foot on and stitch right on that same stitching line. After you've done that, go back and trim to 1/8 inch, and then where there is a curve, especially where there's a curve, like in the, starting about maybe around the shoulder seam, clip in about every 1/2 inch along there. And then same way with the armholes. After you've trimmed, go back and clip in toward the seam, the stitching line, to allow that fabric to either overlap or spread out as it needs to when we turn this right side out. So go ahead and do that stitching, and then we'll be back for the next step. Okay, I've got everything stitched and trimmed, except I forgot to tell you to stitch the back of the bodice. Once we did the shoulder seams, we really have not been following the actual Mary D instructions because we couldn't be piping the way we are following the current instructions. So we've already gone off the rails. So I had forgotten to tell you to stitch there. So don't stitch here, stitch here. Don't do side seams, just stitch at the very, very back. And when you do that, don't stitch all the way down. Stop about 3/4 of an inch from the bottom. And the reason for that is we're going to pipe along there, and then you will finish that seam and trim it. So just stitch part of the way down to about 3/4 of an inch. Go ahead and clip your corner, but just leave your 1/4 inch seam allowance there until you go back near the end and stitch all the way down. Okay, so now it is time to turn right side out. And you do that by pulling the backs through the shoulder seam. There's that one. And you can just kind of shove it all through that shoulder seam. And then this is a good time to give it a good press before any side seams are sewn. So I'm going to give this a good press. I think this is probably a good place to stop for today. Tomorrow we will finish the dress. We will do our side seams and pipe along the bottom of the bodice. We'll make our ties for the front and stitch our skirts in place. So I will see you tomorrow.